Inference Plus, story short number 21. Dappled sunlight peeked through the canopy of trees above the garden and fell across the pink curlers rolled tightly into the old woman's white hair. The morning was cool, and the patches of sun provided pleasant spots of warmth as she went about her pruning. The lantana had never looked more radiant. The foxglove and daffodils were just opening in the light. Soon the rhubarb would be ready to harvest. Morning was Lillian's favorite time of day. It was the time of infinite possibilities, when truly anything could still happen, and the whole world was fresh and new. She breathed in deeply, the bitter pungency of the plants making her nose wrinkle, but even that was part of the garden's charm. Lillian knew it was a cliché, but in this case the saying was the only one that fit. It was her happy place. She smoothed the front of her cotton house dress and made sure that none of the snaps had come undone. It was the one with the short sleeves, and fine red welts ran down both forearms where the leaves of the plants had rubbed against her skin. The irritation was minor, nothing a bit of soap, water, and calamine wouldn't clear up. She had been more diligent about her hands, which were fitted snugly into a pair of bright pink gardening gloves. Lillian backed up to the gate to get a better view of the garden. The oleander bush was overgrown. The spiky leaves and delicate blooms were poking through the fence into the Robinsons' yard again, which wouldn't do. Despite the protestations of her knees and lower back, the pruning would have to be handled immediately. The Robinson children were destructive little monsters who would no doubt love to get their grubby hands all over her oleander. Still, it was a terrible thing, the way that dog of theirs had bitten that little girl last summer. Lillian had tried to tell Matilda Robinson that dog had a nasty streak, but the woman hadn't listened. "He's Larry's dog," the woman said uneasily, "and he's real attached to that dog." Larry was Mrs. Robinson's husband, and from what Lillian could hear when her windows were open to let in the air, had as much of a nasty streak as the dog, a fact that was confirmed by all the accidents Matilda seemed to have on especially angry nights. That poor woman sure walked into a lot of doors. The little girl had needed a dozen stitches and the full series of rabies shots after the bite. Lillian was relieved when that horrible dog had died last month, but the children, Honey and Flynn, were noisier than ever, as though there were a minimum decibel of racket that had to be maintained, and it was now up to them to make up the deficit left by the dog. Ugh, and those names. Honey, Flynn. Such a shame that parents today couldn't muster the self-respect to name their children something appropriate like Mary or Robert. Lillian closed her eyes, took a deep breath and sighed. Every action, she supposed, had an equal and opposite reaction, or something like that. Careful to spare her arms, which had begun to smart, she snipped back the offending oleander branches until none were reachable through the iron fence. She swept the leaves and flowers into her basket to take inside. She'd deal with them when she caught her second wind. She'd take a nice warm shower, then fix a tuna salad sandwich and a glass of iced tea before her stories came on in the afternoon. Once she'd had a chance to get off her feet for a bit, she'd be right as rain again. Back at the house, Lillian left the basket in the mudroom, then stripped off every stitch of clothing right there in the kitchen. It was one of the pleasures of living alone. She looked down, lamenting that her figure wasn't what it had been even 10 years ago. She prodded a wobbly bit of flesh on her lower abdomen and felt a stab of regret. She had wasted her youth and her beauty on a fool, and now all that remained was a sagging, veiny husk. Hank had been gone going on 18 years, and in all that time Lillian had to admit she hadn't missed him for a single moment. She knew she shouldn't think ill of the dead, but the truth was her late husband hadn't been a nice man. Everyone knew Hank had a temper. There are only so many doors a woman can walk into with her face before people start to talk, and Lillian had walked into her fair share of doors during the 26 years she was married. They never had children because Hank didn't want any. Looking back, Lillian saw it was likely for the best, seeing as he was a plenty big baby all by himself. Still, she felt an aching sadness as the years went by and other women first became mothers, then grandmothers. It was the sadness of this that led her to start gardening. She needed something just for herself. That the garden took her outside the eggshell walk of her home made it even more appealing. The yard was mostly a shady one, so the typical tomatoes and marigolds wouldn't grow. She watched in despair as roses and pole beans withered on the vine. She wanted to give up from frustration. Over time, she learned what would flourish in the shade, and she came to understand the old saying about God closing a door but opening a window. There were plenty of books at the local library to guide her, and oh, how her garden grew. After a while, she couldn't even remember why she thought she wanted a baby in the first place. With each passing year, the neighborhood children only grew uglier, while her garden never ceased to grow more beautiful. Which was why what happened in the summer of '92 had been so upsetting. Hank, the big baby, had decided all the hours Lillian spent tending her flowers would be better spent tending to him. When both threats and physical persuasion failed to sway her, he took matters into his own hands in the form of a pump sprayer full of Roundup. When she came home from the grocery store and looked out the kitchen window to the sight of him spraying all her hard work with herbicide, she had howled with all the agony of a brutalized animal. She had begged him to stop, to spare just a few of them. She promised on her late mother's grave that she'd be a better wife, but Hank, never one to back down when he thought he had the advantage, squeezed the trigger on the sprayer until it sputtered to a stop. In the end, he'd managed to coat over half of her garden with the stuff, but there was still a good-sized section that had miraculously been spared. "I wasn't going to do the rhubarb anyhow," Hank huffed indignantly, attempting to play off his poor calculations as an act of mercy. "I like rhubarb pie, and you can make me one." So she did. She cut down the leaves and the stalks, mixed up an old-fashioned Crisco pie crust the same way her mother had done, added it all in, poured a bit of sugar on the top, then baked until it was golden. He hadn't even waited for it to finish cooling before he had a fork in his hand. Lillian watched the fork move back and forth between the metal tin and his fat red face with disconnected fascination. There was a moment, just a brief one, when she considered knocking the fork from his meaty, grimy hand, but then she remembered how that same hand had knocked out one of her premolars when the Bills lost the Super Bowl. The feeling passed. When the shits and the sweats and the burning eyes came on a little later, it was Hank's turn to howl like a brutalized animal. Lillian put on her gardening gloves and the headphones of her Walkman and headed out to do a bit of weeding, never once looking back at the house until the sky grew so dark even the cicadas stopped humming. By then, she'd listened to both sides of her Whitney Houston cassette all the way through 3 times. Only then did she make her way back inside. It gave Lillian a thrill of smug satisfaction to see Hank had died covered in his own throw-up with a full load in his pants. She truly hoped he was looking up from hell at the scene in front of her with the same humiliation she'd felt so many Sundays at church when the men and women alike wouldn't look her in the eye. What she didn't feel now was the slightest twinge of guilt. Her mother had always told her, "Play stupid games, win stupid prizes." As far as Lillian was concerned, Hank had finally gotten his prize. Simple as that. Less simple was the matter of what to do next. But in the end, she'd sorted it out. Men leave their wives all the time, and nobody was too sorry to see a man like Hank take off with some little gal from the city. All in all, the only thing anybody had to say about it was that they were glad Lillian seemed to have recovered her balance. She never ran into another door after Hank ran off. After the shower and the sandwich, Lillian felt revived, just as she had predicted. Once she finished watching The Young and the Restless, she remembered the basket of oleander clippings in the mudroom and resigned herself to an afternoon in the kitchen. After she boiled down the pieces to a syrup, she added no less than 4 cups of sugar and half a cup of lemon juice to the pan, bringing it all back up to a boil again. It just so happened that the mulberry tree was fruiting, so she had a refrigerator full of berries that needed to be used up ASAP. Everyone knows a mulberry won't keep. She added a good 2 quarts of the fruit to the pan and gave it a stir. She made up her mother's Crisco pie crust, scooped the filling in, then popped the finished pie into the oven to get golden brown. When it was finished, she'd run the pie right over to the Robinsons. It was a shame that Matilda and the kids hated mulberries so much. Larry would have to finish the whole thing off, all by himself.